give it a minute as usual to make sure everyone who wants to has a chance to join us, and then we'll get started. So we'll give it just a little bit of time here. If you're just joining, I'm just giving it about 15 more seconds to make sure anyone who wants to has a chance to join us, and then we'll go ahead and get started with today's lesson. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I am Dawn Knight. I am an English teacher at Westfield High School in Westfield, Indiana. I'm sure some of you know that by now, but for those of you new joining us, welcome. We're going to start today by going over the AP exam practice from yesterday. And again, don't worry if you didn't do the lesson, this will still be beneficial to you. Yesterday, I asked you to continue analyzing this prompt by annotating the second half and answering the questions. And we already started to do this in the first half, but you were just supposed to continue brainstorming and looking for patterns, and then do a final answer of the questions as you put it all together. First, let's just read the prompt itself for those who weren't here yesterday. The following article is a mock press release from The Onion, a publication devoted to humor and satire. Read the article carefully, then write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices The Onion makes to convey its message about how products are marketed to consumers. So let's go over this together and see how you did. First, let's take a look at some of the annotations I did here. We'll just read through them together. I'll read through the second half of the prompt here. For those of you just joining, the first half of the prompt is going to be very similar to this. It's a mock press conference about a product called Magnasols. In addition, Magnasols employ a brand new cutting-edge form of pseudoscience known as pteronometry, developed specially for integrated products by some of the nation's top pseudoscientists. All right, so here I annotated for the product name and also the fact that it was brand new and cutting edge. I think that idea that the consumer might want this shiny and new object. And again, we have pseudoscience and pseudoscientists that tell us this is satire, it's irony, it's not real. The principles of pteronometry state that the Earth resonates on a very precise frequency, which it imparts to the surfaces it touches, said Dr. Wayne Frankel, the California State University bioelectrician who discovered pteronometry. If the frequency of one's foot is out of alignment with the Earth, the entire body will suffer. Special resonator nodules implanted at key spots in Magnasols convert the wearer's own energy to match the Earth's natural vibrational rate of 32.805 kilofrankels. The resultant harmonic energy field rearranges the foot's naturally occurring atoms, converting the pain nuclei into pleasing comfortrons. Okay, so we have expert testimony from this Dr. Wayne Frankel guy. We have the word choice that of medical and scientific-like terms. Released less than a week ago, the $19.95 insoles are already proving popular among consumers who are hailing them as a welcome alternative to expensive, effective forms of traditional medicine. I should have highlighted effective, that part's funny. So basically, you have this idea that it's the 1995 thing, which obviously makes fun of that buy one, get one free. It's just 1995. Already popular, it's a welcome alternative. These are all things that kind of mimic those ads we always see. And notice that it's an alternative to effective forms of medicine. In other words, this one isn't because it's fake. Okay, then we get into something a little new here. I twisted my ankle something awful a few months ago and the pain was so bad I could barely walk a single step, said Helene Kuhn of Edison, New Jersey. But after wearing Magnasols for 7 weeks, I've noticed a significant decrease in pain and can now walk comfortably. Just try to prove that Magnasols didn't heal me. Okay, so now we have customer testimony. It's also funny because she says the 7-week thing. And if you've ever twisted an ankle, you know that in about 7 weeks, the pain has probably dissipated quite a bit already. So it's probably not due to magnesols. Equally impressed was chronic back pain sufferer Jeff DeAngelis of Tacoma, Washington. Why should I pay thousands of dollars to have my spine realigned with physical therapy when I can pay $20 for insoles clearly endorsed by an intelligent-looking man in a white lab coat? DeAngelis asked. Magnesols really seem like they're working. Okay, so more customer testimony, medical terms, not a real scientist, just some guy in a lab coat is the funny part, the irony. Like, this is not real. Okay, now let's look at some of the patterns. And some of this we noticed before. We're just adding a few of the new things to the list. So keep in mind that we want to think about overall choices. We don't want to just list things when we do a rhetorical analysis essay. So we're thinking about what are the patterns that show us that these are very specific choices being made for specific purposes. So some of the patterns we may have noticed here, that it mimics the press release for these products or advertising for these products with expert testimony, customer testimonials, the jargon with the medical and scientific terms, or at least sound like medical and scientific sounding terms. Word choice to sound like a formal product announcement. But also here we have the irony, the fact that it's not real, that the onion's just making a point. So that wouldn't work very well if we didn't recognize it as irony. So they have to throw in these hints like the pseudoscience and pseudoscientist, 7 weeks, intelligent looking man in a lab coat, the comparing it to something that actually is effective. We also see hyperbole, that it would heal your entire body, for example. And when we looked yesterday at the first half, we noticed the idea of things being more. There were more than 5 forms of pseudoscience in this particular product, and more than 200 contour points and things like that. So that idea of more is something apparently that customers want. This time we also see adding in that brand new and cutting edge are things that apparently appeal to customers. Okay, now let's look and see what all of this means together. So let's answer the questions. First of all, how is this an example of irony? Well, it appears to be a real product, but it isn't. But what is the message? What's the point? So if you remember when we talked about satire and irony yesterday, satire points out issues in society. And there were quite a few, I think, different messages that you could look at here, both about the advertiser and the customer, the consumer, and maybe society in general. So we want to make sure that we get back to what is the prompt asking. So if you look where I highlighted there, it says, write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices the Onion makes to convey its message about how products are marketed to consumers. So that's what we need to focus on for that purpose. So you might say something about companies appeal to the gullibility of American consumers to sell them useless products, or to their greed, that idea of more and better. And some of the rhetorical choices being used, that's when we look back at the patterns. We're not just listing, we're thinking about what are those overall things. So again, word choice, mimicry, hyperbole, and irony. And are they effective? And this is up to you to decide, but you would in an essay have to show using specific examples. So I think this one was particularly effective because of the mimicry. The fact that it's recognizable as an ad. We knew exactly what they were doing here. Very recognizable. In fact, if you took out the pseudoscience stuff, this could be any number of products. The hyperbole and word choice show that it isn't real, so we do recognize it as satire and know that it's sending us a message. And that's really important. Good irony does let you know that it's being ironic. If you've ever seen somebody share an Onion article on Facebook, for example, going, I can't believe this isn't true, or this is true. And you want to say, well, it's not, it's satire. So if you can't recognize it as that, it's not sending you the right message. Okay, lesson overview. Here's what we're doing for today. Today's lesson is about appeals. So we're going to look deeper at these. We've mentioned them a couple of times before, but we're going to look a little deeper into the appeals today. ethos, pathos, and logos, or ethical, emotional, and logical appeal. But more importantly, we're going to look at how they relate to the rhetorical analysis essay. So here's what you need to know. First of all, I want to just go back to rhetoric, because I think a lot of times we say that word over and over again, rhetoric and rhetorical, and we don't really talk about what it means. So rhetoric is just effective, persuasive language use, which means that when we're analyzing the rhetorical choices, we're looking at choices a writer makes and how effective they are in being persuasive. And the key elements of rhetoric typically are the rhetorical situation, tone, and appeals. And today we're going to delve a little deeper into how those things work together. So if you remember this rhetorical situation from our first week of lessons, we talked about the Abigail Adams prompt and the rhetorical situation in that prompt. One of the keys to analyzing a writer's choices is to understand the rhetorical situation. The exigence is just why they wrote, what prompted them to write. The purpose is what they're trying to do. Who is their audience? What's the context? What's going on at the time? Who is the writer and who is their audience? That's important, especially the interaction between the two. And then what's their overall message? So those things are important to understand because they help us figure out why a writer makes the choices they make. So if the audience, or if the writer knows their audience well enough to know what might be effective in persuading them, that's going to help them convey that message, right? So we talked about this as the rhetorical triangle as well, and I think sometimes that might be a little easier for you to think about. The rhetorical triangle is just speaker, audience, purpose. And if you remember when we had that triangle, we had the arrows that pointed back and forth to each other. It's the interaction among those things that are important, and those get us back into this rhetorical situation with exigence and purpose. So the important thing here is to remember you're thinking about what does the writer know about the audience and how does that help them convey the message. So you don't have to memorize all these terms or drop all of these terms in. Okay, tone is also important here as speakers choose a tone they think will be suitable for a specific purpose and audience. A letter to my grandma, for example, is going to look a lot different than a cover letter I'm sending to a potential employer. The tone of the letter to my grandma might be playful, loving, nostalgic even, whereas the one, or even humorous, whereas the one to a potential employer is going to be very formal, sophisticated, maybe informative about who I am and what I do and what I would bring to the table. So tone is important because it reflects our knowledge of the audience and our purpose. And a writer conveys that through word choice, sentence structure, and imagery or details. And then finally, the writer has to make strategic choices based on what they know about the rhetorical situation in order to persuade the audience. So if you look here, just to give you some example of what these mean again. So ethos is an ethical appeal, which means it appeals to our shared values. It illustrates credibility. Logos is appealing to logic or reason, and pathos is appealing to emotion. So let's say you're trying to get someone to stop smoking, as a very general example. You might tell a friend, you know, these little kids, younger kids look up to you, or your younger brother or younger sister look up to you. And so you should really be a better example to them. That might be appealing to ethos because you know that their value, they value being this role model for their siblings. You could say smoking causes 480,000 deaths a year in the United States, and that would be appealing to logic. Logically, if it does that, it's not a good idea. Or emotionally, I lost someone important to me because of smoking. I don't want to lose you too. That would be an emotional appeal. And sometimes the strongest appeals are when you put them all together. So we're going to look at a speech that Patrick Henry famously gave to the Virginia Convention in 1775, and he did use a combination of all three of these. His purpose was to convince the delegates that it was time to go to war against England. Keep in mind, and you may have studied this speech before in a history class or in an American literature class, and maybe not, and that's okay if you haven't. He was going to have to really pull out all the stops here to convince this group that it was time to go to war against England. Keeping in mind a couple of things. One is England was probably the most powerful country on earth at the time, and they would be fighting against their own king, against their own country, which is treason, the punishment for which is death. So they were really risking everything, their family, their lives, in order to go to war, to probably not win. It was a huge risk. And he was convincing them they should do this in this speech. So obviously he had to really, really use the appeals to make this happen. So let's see what Patrick Henry did to convince them to go to war, because we know that happened. So I'd like you to read the first half of Henry's speech, annotating for the appeals and the rhetorical situation, thinking about where you're seeing that appeal to emotion or logic or shared beliefs and ethics. I'm just going to let you pause here and take a couple of minutes to do that, and then I'll go ahead and move on. So whenever you're ready, you can hit play and continue on with us here. So yours might vary a little bit, but here are some of the things that I annotated for, and I want to go through this. I'll read through the paragraph, pointing out some of the things that I annotated as we go. And then I'm going to have you try this again in the second half. Hopefully this one will give you some more ideas to think about as you go through the second time. No man thinks more highly than I do of the patriotism as well as the abilities of the very worthy gentlemen who have just addressed the House. But different men often see the same subjects in different lights, and therefore I hope it will not be thought disrespectful to those gentlemen if, entertaining as I do opinions of a character very opposite to theirs, I shall speak forth my sentiments freely and without reserve. This is no time for ceremony. The question before the House is one of awful moment to this country. For my own part, I consider it as nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery, and in proportion to the magnitude of the subject ought to be the freedom of the debate. It is only in this way that we can hope to arrive at the truth and fulfill the great responsibility which we hold to God and our country. Should I keep back my opinions at such a time through fear of giving offense, I should consider myself as guilty of treason towards my country and of an act of disloyalty toward the majesty of heaven, which I revere above all earthly kings. Okay, so a couple of different things going on here. We see this idea of patriotism. That would be an example of ethos, that shared patriotism, shared belief. We also see logos, that different opinions exist, and that we should respect those differing opinions, would be pathos, the appeal to emotion. We see some of the rhetorical situation in this paragraph, that tensions with England are high. We also see antithesis used here as logos, as logic. If your only choices are freedom or slavery, your choice is obvious. Logically, the only choice there is freedom. So he's telling them, we actually don't have a choice. This is the only choice. There's a responsibility to God and country that he brings up, which would be ethos and pathos. Logos has to state the opinion, or treason. He would feel like he was guilty of treason if he didn't state that opinion. So that's logical. And then ethos, again, that obligation to God. And notice some of those overlap. Sometimes, there's the idea of the shared belief and faith in God is definitely ethos because it's shared values, but it's also an emotional appeal to those beliefs. Okay, let's look at the second paragraph. Mr. President, it is natural to man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and listen to the song of that siren till she transforms us into beasts. Is this the part of wise men engaged in a great and arduous struggle for liberty? Are we disposed to be of the number of those who, having eyes, see not, and having ears, hear not, the things which so nearly concern their temporal salvation? For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it. All right, so we have the respect here with the Mr. President, which is appealing emotionally with some respect. Um, there's an allusion here to the sirens, and in mythology, they sang beautiful songs that would lure sailors to their deaths. And so he's comparing England to that. They're going to tell us these things we want to hear, but they're like deadly sirens, which would be logical appeal. And then rhetorical questions, the answer is obvious in a rhetorical question. So when he's asking those questions, he's not looking for answers because to him the answer is obvious. So this is a logical appeal. And then finally, there's a biblical allusion with the having ears, hear not, having eyes, see not, that would be an appeal to those shared values again. Okay, let's look at the next paragraph. I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way of judging the future but by the past. And judging by the past, I wish to know what there has been in the conduct of the British ministry for the last 10 years to justify those hopes with which gentlemen have been pleased to solace themselves and the House. Is it that insidious smile with which our petition has been lately received? Trust it not, sir. It will prove a snare to your feet. Suffer not yourselves to be betrayed with a kiss. Ask yourselves how this gracious reception of our petition comports with those warlike preparations which cover our waters and darken our land. Are fleets and armies necessary to a work of love and reconciliation? Have we shown ourselves so unwilling to be reconciled that force must be called in to win back our love? Let us not deceive ourselves, sir. These are the implements of war and subjugation, the last arguments to which kings resort. I ask, gentlemen, sir, what means this martial array, if its purpose be not to force us to submission? Can gentlemen assign any other possible motive for it? Has Great Britain any enemy in this quarter of the world to call for all this accumulation of navies and armies? No, sir, she has none. They are meant for us, they can be meant for no other. They are sent over to bind and rivet upon us those chains which the British ministry have been so long forging. And what have we to oppose them? Shall we try argument? Sir, we've been trying that for the last 10 years. Have we anything new to offer upon the subject? Nothing. We've held this subject up in every light of which it is capable, but it has all been in vain. Shall we resort to entreaty and humble supplication? What terms shall we find which have not been already exhausted? Let us not, I beseech you, sir, deceive ourselves. Sir, we have done everything that could be done to avert the storm which is now coming on. Okay, so a lot going on here, and I won't go through every single thing, but I do want to point out a couple of them. There are a couple of more biblical allusions, so that's a pattern that we can start to see emerging here, that there's this appeal to that shared belief. There's also the rhetorical situation in here that England is making warlike preparations, and the logical appeal of there's no one else here they would be fighting, so why would they be doing that if not to fight us? So keep in mind, he knows the rhetorical situation, he knows his audience, and he's appealing to those things through these choices he's making and allusions to shared beliefs. And he's using the Sir and Mr. President throughout to continue that respectful interchange. Okay, so we're going to do this again one last time with just the last 3 short paragraphs of this pretty short but powerful speech by Patrick Henry. So I want you to do the same thing. You're going to read on your own, and then we'll talk through what we noticed. And again, it's okay if yours vary a little from mine. We just want to kind of start practicing and see how these all come together. And then we're going to talk about what it means for the rhetorical analysis essay. Sorry, you can pause here first if you want, so you can do it. I will move on. Okay, so I'm moving on. If you are ready, you're ready to join us now. We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated, we have prostrated ourselves before the throne and have implored its interposition to arrest the tyrannical hands of the ministry and parliament. I think that's an important one to stop and think about. So he's using parallel structure here. And we've talked about structure and syntax before. And this is a really good example of how it can help aid meaning. In this case, it's part of the logical appeal. It's a list that we can't miss because of the parallelism. We've done this, we've done this, we've done this, we've done this, and nothing has worked. And so logically, there's nothing else left to try. Our petitions have been slighted, our remonstrances have produced additional violence and insult, our supplications have been disregarded, and we've been spurned with contempt from the foot of the throne. In vain, after these things, may we indulge the fond hope of peace and reconciliation. There is no longer any room for hope. If we wish to be free, if we mean to preserve inviolate those inestimable privileges for which we've been so long contending, if we mean not basely to abandon the noble struggle in which we've been so long engaged, and which we've pledged ourselves never to abandon until the glorious object of our contest shall be obtained, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left us. Okay, so we have parallelism in there. We have that shared desire for freedom. And again, knowing this group of people who came and colonized in order to have some freedom, this is obviously something that's going to appeal to them. And again, they have the shared belief in God. We also see the repetition of we must fight, we must fight. And that would be part of that logical appeal of this is all that's left to do. They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be the next week or the next year? Will it be when we're totally disarmed and when a British guard shall be stationed in every house? Shall we gather strength by irresolution and inaction? Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs and hugging the delusive phantom of hope until our enemies shall have bound us hand and foot? Some pretty strong imagery there. Sir, we are not weak if we make a proper use of those means which the God of nature hath placed in our power. The millions of people armed in the holy cause of liberty and in such a country as that which we possess are invincible by any force which our enemy can send against us. Besides, sir, we shall not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations and who will raise up friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. Besides, sir, we have no election. If we were base enough to desire it, it is now too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat it, sir, let it come. Okay, so again, there's a lot going on here. The logos of the only other option is slavery if we don't fight is a strong logical appeal, but it's also an emotional one, particularly with the imagery there. And of course, it's also something that we know that they had slaves, and so this is also a little interesting that they're talking so much about freedom and slavery and not recognizing it in themselves. Okay, but that's a totally different story. So thinking about the imagery of the chains and slavery and that emotional appeal that would do. All right, last paragraph. It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And that's probably the most famous line from the speech. And again, it gets back to that choice. So when you compare something to its opposite in order to really hit home what you're trying to convey, in this case, liberty or death, is that idea of the antithesis, right? It's comparing something to its obvious or to its opposite. There's only one choice there, and that clearly is liberty. And it's the same thing with freedom or slavery. There's that antithesis we talked about. Okay, so we have strong imagery to convey this emotional appeal here. We have rhetorical questions again where the answer is obvious, so there's that logical appeal. Okay, but that's not enough to just go through and list everything that we see. We need to think about what does it mean and what patterns emerge. So we also need to look at, was it effective? And then we need to show how effective it is with examples. So that's going to take us to today's practice because you're actually going to do that for your practice exam today. First, let me briefly talk about what we did, thinking about rhetorical situation and how important that is. So Patrick Henry wouldn't have been able to appeal to his audience without knowing what those things were that would appeal to them emotionally, and that would appeal to their shared values. So he had to know his audience well to do that. That's really important here. And then the logical appeal, obviously, as well. And then we need to think about, was it effective in doing that? So today's exam practice is to complete this chart. You're going to be looking for 2 examples of each of the appeals. So ethos is ethical, pathos is emotional, and logos is logical. So you're looking for examples of those in the Patrick Henry speech. And you'll find this chart and the speech in today's AP exam practice that's in the video description below. You'll find 2 examples and explain whether you think this would be effective based on the connection to the rhetorical situation. So you'll find the example and you'll think about how it relates to the rhetorical situation and then whether or not you think that's effective because of that. So you'll do that for 2 examples for each of those types of appeals. All right, that is it for today. Mrs. Velitis will be with you tomorrow, and I think I'll be back next Wednesday. So you'll have her for a few days, and I will see you in the middle of next week. I hope you have an amazing day. Stay active, stay healthy, and remember that a lot of us care a lot about you. Okay, thanks. Bye.